In this online lesson, you will learn how to factor any quadratic if possible. Now we're going to build on two things you already know. First, you already know how to factor a quadratic such as x squared plus 5x plus 6. And second, you already know how to multiply binomials by double distributing. Now this is key because factoring a quadratic is just simply working backwards, undoing or reversing the double distributive property. Double distributive, you can think about that when you're multiplying, is working forwards, and then factoring is working backwards. Second of all, we're going to talk about quadratics in two different ways. Remember, a quadratic can be in standard form or a quadratic can be in factored form. Now, heads up, this lesson is going to be a little bit longer than the typical mini lesson, and there are going to be lots of examples. So take breaks as needed and only take notes for what is most important to you. Let's start with the factored form of a quadratic. Now to factor, remember, you must undo the double distributive property. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one step forward by distributing and then one step back to undo it. And in that way, see what our process is to factor a quadratic. All right, so our first step in factored form is to distribute. And this is, I think of this as distributing first, 4x times 3x plus 1, plus 1, plus 2 times 3x plus 1. And we'll think about this as the first step in distributing. We'll call that distributing number 1. Now, if we think about going backwards, what we need to do to undo that distributing number 1 is notice 3x plus 1, 3x plus 1. 3x plus 1 is the GCF of these two terms. So to go backwards to get where we started, we simply need to factor out the GCF. And this is something you already know how to do. So we factor out 3x plus 1, and we're left with the remaining factors, 4x plus 2. All right, great, off to a good start. Next, let's do the second round of distributing. So 4x times 3x, 12x squared, plus 4x, plus 6x, 2 times 3x, plus 2 times 1. And we think of that as distributing number 2. Now to undo distributing number 2, we're going to do something new to us. And it's called factoring by grouping. And we're going to look at a couple of examples to see how this is done. Factoring by grouping. Let's think of that as just a side examples we're going to look at to see how this works. All right, factoring by grouping. Here's an example. 20x squared minus 4x plus 15x minus 3. The way factoring by grouping works is we take the terms in pairs. So we'll take the first two and look at those, and then we'll take the second two. Factoring by grouping will work with any even number of terms. We'll look at the first, 20x squared minus 4x, and I'm going to factor out the GCF, 4x. So that becomes 4x times 5x minus 4x times 1. Then I'm going to look at the second two terms, 15x plus 3, that second pair, and I'm going to factor out its GCF, which is 3. 3 times 5x minus 1. And look at this, so cool. When we factor it out, they have a GCF of the binomial 5x minus 1. So I can factor out that 5x minus 1, minus 1, and I'm left with the remaining factors, 4x plus 3. All right, factoring by grouping. Let's look at a second example. And we'll look at 12x squared minus 10x plus, minus 18x plus 15. Now I'm going to rewrite the minus 18x as plus negative just to see that negative goes with the 18. Factoring by grouping, we look at the first two terms, and then the next two terms. And I'm going to factor out the GCF. For the first two terms, that's 2x. So 2x times 6x minus 5. Can quickly check by redistributing 2x times 6x, 12x squared, 2x times minus 5 minus 10x. Now when I look at the next pair of terms, my goal is to be able to get the same binomial, 6x minus 5. Notice that negative 5. To get 15 into negative 5, I'm going to have to factor out a negative 3. So my GCF here is to factor out a negative 3, leaving me with 6x minus 5. And I did that again, so my binomials are the same. That's my GCF. So I can factor out my GCF, and I'm left with my remaining factors, 2x plus a negative 3 or minus 3. Some people like to think of the area model for this. I'll draw a quick area model for you. And we have 12x squared minus 10x minus 18x and plus 15. When you factor by grouping, you're looking column by column. So I'll look at this first column and the GCF, 2x. We're left with 6x and minus 5. And then I think minus 5 times what will give me positive 15. And that's what tells me this needs to be minus 3. Let's check that too. Minus 3 times 6x does indeed give me negative 18x. All right, so this is called factoring by grouping, and that's how we get to undo the second step of the distributing property and get that back to the original first step. All right, now the last step when working forward when multiplying is to combine our like terms. So we'll have 12x squared plus 10x plus 2. And this gives us the standard form of our quadratic, so standard form here. And we're kind of done with the multiplying, with the distributing. So that last step, if we want to think about calling that a name, we'll call that combining like terms. Now to go backwards from combining like terms, what we need to do is we need to split the middle term. And by middle term, again, we need the term with the x, so the bx. So we need to split the middle term. And in this example, 10x was split into two terms, 4x and 6x. Let's look a little bit more closely at splitting the middle term. And we're going to find this is really similar to what we were doing when we were factoring the simpler quadratic where a is equal to 1. So let's generalize. I've got this quadratic, ax squared plus bx plus c. And to split the middle term, I'm looking for, okay, diamond problem, two numbers, we'll call them m and n, who add, m plus n is going to be b, and who multiply, okay, should feel really similar, but now they have to multiply not just to c, but to the product of a times c. So this is the new piece right here. Once we have those two numbers, those numbers tell us how we're going to split the middle term. So it's going to become ax squared plus mx plus nx plus c. And the cool thing about this technique, it doesn't matter which order you put them in. It could have been nx plus mx for that. All right, let's look at an example to help see how this works. We'll go 12x squared plus 10x plus 2. We'll go back to our original example. Now we're looking for two numbers who add together to 10 and multiply together to be the product of 12 times 2, or 24. And those two numbers are 4 and 6. And that tells us how we're going to split our middle term. It's going to become 4x plus 6x. Again, undoing combining like terms. And notice that gets us from the quadratic in standard form, and we go back one step, and we're now in the form ready to do factoring by grouping. All right, let's end with one good example of putting all these pieces together. And let's factor 2x squared minus 13x minus 7. I'm going to start by splitting the middle term, working backwards. I need to find two numbers whose sum is negative 13 and whose product is 2 times negative 7, or negative 14. All right, those two numbers are going to be 1 and negative 14. With this information, I'm going to split my middle term. So it's going to be 2x squared plus 1x minus 14x minus 7. And again, it doesn't matter which order you put those terms in. Next is working backwards. I'm going to factor by grouping. I'm going to take my first pair of terms, and I'm just going to make this plus negative 14 to make sure that negative goes with the 14. And my second pair of terms. For 2x squared plus x, the GCF is simply 1x. And when I factor it out, I'll be left with 2x plus 1. All right, then plus my GCF of negative 14x and negative 7 is going to be, let's do negative 7. And that will leave me with 2x plus 1. Well, that makes me super happy because I see I have this binomial, 2x plus 1 is my GCF. And I'm going to factor out that GCF, 2x plus 1, and multiply by the remaining factors, x plus a negative 7 or minus 7. So I've taken this quadratic, 2x squared minus 13x minus 7, and factored it into x minus 7 times 2x plus 1. In summary, factoring a quadratic, any quadratic in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, is just working the double distributive property backwards. And in reverse order, we had the steps. We started with our quadratic in standard form. We split the middle term. Then we factored by grouping. And then we finally factored out the GCF, which is going to be a binomial. I'm going to have a couple more lessons that will walk through some examples that you can watch if you want to see more. And I just want to highlight, watch out, not all quadratics can be factored. So just keep your eyes open for that.